So, good evening, everyone. And you're very welcome to Cafe Theology reinstated after COVID and all the rest. This is the biggest crowd we've had for Cafe Theology since it started. Our very first talk, I remember, was with John Waters, and he had around 100 and something, but the chairs were at 120, and we had to bring in, I think we're at 140 or something, which is marvellous. And these two young lads here have come all the way from Kilkenny, and they're sitting on the two high stools over there. And they've already thought about ordering Guinness, but that's very good. So it's just wonderful to see everyone here. Most welcome to the Granville Hotel and Cafe Theology, and I hope you've availed of a cup of coffee, and thanks to the staff. We have this one microphone, and Gavin has come all the way from England. He lives near the Welsh border, and he came over here on his BMW motorbike 1250. 1250. That's, think of a Honda 50 multiplied by whatever it is today. 1250. It's a very unique bike, and it's still parked outside in the car park across the road. And Gavin is from London. He was born in London, and I think many of you have been following him on YouTube. His last posting, or one of his last postings on YouTube, was about the royal coronation to take place on I think it's the 5th of May, is it, or 6th of May? 6th of May, and he got nearly 300,000 views. So it's no wonder that so many of you have turned out here tonight. So Gavin was a Church of England priest, at one stage bishop, at one stage chaplain to Her Majesty, and resigned that post in 2017. And he will tell us really his story tonight, which is entitled Crossing the Tiber. So we'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll give an opportunity for people just to chat among themselves, and then there'll be loads of opportunity for Q&A afterwards. So we'll give a warm welcome to Gavin.
It is wonderful to see you all, but I understand that some of you are here because you think I can get you tickets to the coronation. Well, I can say as I'll try, but I'm not optimistic. It's very nice to have Philip. Philip, you're 12 or 14, I think, which? 14. Philip's here because he's very interested in theology. And I think that's wonderful, because so am I. And we're surrounded by a culture that's really good on all the questions of how to do things, although when it comes to economics, they're not that good. We're very poor on the why questions, and that's partly what we're talking about tonight. I have no idea how best to structure this in 30 minutes, but I hope that some of the more interesting things will happen during the questions. But what I want to do, I think, is to talk about why become a Christian in the first place, and then crossing the Tiber, and then why it's very important to be a Catholic, what the Catholic Church is going to bring to the cultural revolution that we're just sitting on the edge of. And I want to start with some stories, really. The first story I want to start with is the healing of the beggar in St. Mark chapter 8. It's a rather odd story. This man comes along, he's blind, and he's given to Jesus, and Jesus lays some spit in his eyes, and it only half works. So he sees, but he says it's a bit like trees moving, and St. Mark talks about him recovering his sight. So he was obviously able to see at some stage. And our Lord takes him out and does something extra, and he sees clearly. So the reason I wanted to start with that is because I became a Christian when I was 21 after a particularly difficult crisis. And I'm a bit cross that I've had to wait such a long time for the second stage of healing. I saw spiritually as a Christian, but it was only becoming a Catholic that the whole of the rest of the picture came into place. And it's only if you haven't seen the whole picture that you know how important it is. So this isn't the enthusiasm of somebody changing teams and suddenly saying, oh, I like my new team better. I have to say the old team are not pleased with me. And I can understand why. It isn't about changing teams. It's about getting into the heart of things. And one of the things, as I've met with Catholics, having become a Catholic, and indeed some Catholics have said to me, what on earth are you so excited about? I would say, well, it just is the most amazing way of being a Christian. And I don't think perhaps you quite appreciate what you've been given compared to the splendid road I had before. It was quite splendid, but it was still like seeing trees walking rather than actually seeing much more clearly. And it's the supernatural that's at the heart of Catholicism that is so enormously important, and it's the supernatural that is completely contended. We've faced a society for over 150 years where we've been hammered away by rationalists, all the new atheists, very clever people like Fry and Dawkins, who've had the media, the ear of the media, and the media have been only too pleased to give us this beating around the ears. And so we're really, as a church and as a community, we're pretty worn down by it. And there haven't been many people to be willing to compete. I was telling a story earlier on today, but I'll tell it again because I think it's important. I'm not particularly clever, I'm not particularly well read, but you don't have to be very clever to be a Christian. There's a degree of kind of common sense required, and not all intellectuals have this common sense. I spent 25 years being an academic and a chaplain at university, and one of the moments that was really quite critical was when Richard Dawkins came and we gave him a doctorate. And because I was a chaplain to the Queen, I was dressed like a beetroot or a cardinal sitting in the front row. And Dawkins was very, very, very rude about the church and Christianity. And everyone watched me, and my face got redder and redder. And it was very hard not to stand up and ask him not to take cheap pot shots. And there he had a whole captive audience. And he's a clever man, a clever speaker. By the way, if you want to see a little bit of revenge, we don't believe in revenge, but just in case, you just Google YouTube and put in Cardinal Pell and Richard Dawkins. There's just a moment when they're talking together in Australia, and Dawkins makes a complete ass of himself, and Pell holds him. It's just a beautiful moment. You see a cardinal of the church bringing the intelligence and the humility and above all the common sense to the situation. And Dawkins just digs a hole and then just falls straight into it. Well, I only take delight in it because he spent such a long time trying to push Christians into that hole. So it's not about revenge, more really about showing that the man's arguments were problematic. Anyway, as it happened, after this awful event, he and I were disrobing together, and we had pegs next to each other. And I thought, well, this is the Lord's sense of humour, hooray. You know, who else would the Lord put next to him but me, thank God. So I said to him, Richard, you're always making fun of idiot Christians. He'd just done a documentary with, I'm sorry for any Americans here, and any Americans listening, block your ears now, but he'd done a documentary with some not very bright Midwestern farmers who have a not very developed view of evolution, and just bullied them mercilessly and made fun of them. And so I said, Richard, look, you've been very rude about Christ and about the church and about me and my friends. So there's a dinner now. Would you mind if we had a public debate? I'd like to hold you to account for those things. I think you're completely mistaken, and I can prove it. And he looked at me very awkwardly and said, I haven't got time for this kind of... And to tell you the truth, I may be fooling myself, I thought I saw fear in his bright blue eyes. I really did. And he scuttled for the door and went out. So then in the corner there were several, well, very eminent scientists, one or two who had Nobel Prizes of their own. And they came up to me and they said, Gav, have you just been rude to our friend? And I said, no, I was very polite to him. I was just pissed off because he was being so rude. Excuse me, I beg your pardon, sorry. I know where the confessional is. I was just very upset at the way in which he was being so rude, and I asked him for a public debate. I had been holding my own in the university for some time. There was a group of biologists who used to hang around the bar to torment the chaplain. They'd buy me enough drinks, try and get me tipsy, and then make a fool of me, except that they didn't. And not because I was clever or well-read, but because what you need to understand is that most of the new atheists are very clever in their field. But unlike Philip, they stopped thinking aged 11. They've never had a fresh thought about why. They just haven't. It's not on their map. They got very good at the how stuff, they won Nobel Prizes, they became professors. But the why questions are really very problematic. And if you don't answer them, you get people who are depressed and who don't work and who don't flourish. And so Dawkins went off, and my friend said, well, if he has got a train to catch, we'll do it instead. And we sat down around a table, and for about 3 hours we drank and talked and argued. And they were very surprised. I mean, let me give you an example of the level of stupidity that one's dealing with, some of my clever professors. There was one man I liked very much. We saw each other on the path one morning outside the science faculty, and he said, we had a hug and a good morning. He said, oh, Gavin, I like you very much, he said, but, you won't like me, I'm an atheist. And I said, well, what's that got to do with anything? Well, you Christians are a bit narrow-minded, you want people to believe like you do. And I said, you're so wrong. I said, I'm an atheist too, so, let's go and have a coffee together. Oh, what's he talking about? You're an atheist. I said, well, I'm an atheist. You're not. I said, look, tell me the God you don't like and the God you don't believe in. I tell you, this is like stealing candy from children. It's so easy. And so he said, well, of course I don't believe in a God. I don't believe in a masculine deity who peeks out over the garden wall into time and space and slaps people around and threatens them into behaving and forces them and controls them. I don't believe in your omnipotent God in this world. And I said, well, that's why I'm an atheist. I don't believe in that either. But I wouldn't remotely begin to believe in a ghastly cosmic puppeteer like that, which is the way, of course, the new scientists present him. I said, what do you do about the fact that we're stuck here longing for meaning? For most of the universe we're not, and then we are, and then we're not again. And how on earth do you make sense of all the longing we have for these abstract things, none of which you can prove, like truth and beauty and love and forgiveness and joy and hope? How do you measure those things, you scientists? How do you prove them? You haven't got a clue. These are things utterly and completely beyond you, but without them, people can't function. Let me tell you about Kate. Kate, my chaplaincy went through a bad period of time, and people stopped coming, and I thought, well, perhaps I should give up and everyone can go to the Mass in the city. Lots of churches in the city. And so I was talking to we got down to about 12, really. We fluctuated between 12 and 60. It wasn't really bad compared to other chaplains, but I was getting a bit demoralised, and I thought maybe I'm flogging a dead horse here. I talked to my students. We always had lunch after the Eucharist. And I said to my students, look guys, I think probably, maybe you should go to proper churches in town. And we did all kinds of things during the week. And one of my students, who was a doctor of mathematics, said, come and do the washing up with me, will you? So I went in and we did the washing up together, and she rolled up her sleeves. And I'd never seen her with her rolled up sleeves before, but she had really badly scarred arms. She's a very clever woman, very big, very dignified, very fiercely intelligent, a woman I respected greatly. But her arms had been hacked to pieces as we washed up. And so I said to her, I guess you wanted me to see your arms. Why? I didn't know you suffered from self-harming. Yes, she said, I do. So now let me tell you that one day, a couple of years ago, halfway through my studies, I fell into complete despair and I decided to take my life. I'm a scientist, I'm methodical, I worked out how to do it, but I thought, I'll just give God, in case he's there, he didn't believe in him, one last chance. I'll go to church. So with everything laid up in my room, I came here, I walked upstairs, and I heard you talk about Jesus, and I fell in love with him, and I didn't kill myself. Now, she said, turning with him very fiercely, do you think saving one life is worth keeping the doors here open on a Sunday? I said, yes. Well, let's have no more talk of closing the Eucharist down and going somewhere else. Now, this was just one. There were lots of them, lots of stories like this. I had a radio show once upon a time on the BBC. It was a faith and ethics program. It was quite successful. People became Christians every week. I wasn't allowed to promote Christianity, but I was allowed to make life difficult for Buddhists and New Agers and weirdos who phoned in. And there was one more amazing moment when a woman who'd become a Christian talked about why she'd become a Christian. Now this is a bit awful, I'm really sorry, but her lover had decided to trap her in the bath and pour petrol over her and set her alight. Now she survived, but she had the most terrible burns. And the difficulty she had was forgiving him. You and I would have the same kind of difficulty. She lived tormented not only by her physical condition, but by the hate that she had in her heart and the need for revenge, until she met Christ. And when she heard about Jesus and met him, she became a Christian, and she managed to forgive this man who did this utterly dreadful thing to her. But she was very badly disfigured. But it just so happened there was another man in the city who went blind, and he also became a Christian. And somehow, by some miracle, this blind man met this disfigured woman, and they both loved Jesus, and they fell in love, and they got married. He couldn't see her disfigurement. And they came on the radio to talk about their love for each other and their love for God. And people cried and wept, and lots of people in Brighton became Christians that day as they heard how an experience of the love and the mercy and the forgiveness of God can reach down into the most destitute of human circumstances and give people new hope, new life, new purpose, new meaning. And not because we need meaning by itself, but because the only kind of God I could believe in, I found myself saying on my first journey, the first healing, so to speak, is a God who, having taken the risk of making us all so individual, all so utterly unique, and then this enormous risk of giving us freedom of choice, which is so terrifying because we're so capable of going wrong. And also, there is some kind of metaphysical evil, a pollutant, adding its own toxicity to the whole effect. Can he really take responsibility for this venture? There's a lovely English mystic called Julian of Norwich who asks in she has in about 1485, she has near-death experiences, she's dying, and she sees all kinds of unpleasant things, including the devil. But she has these wonderful conversations with Jesus, as so many holy women do over the years, and Catholic holy women, I have to say. And she asks him and says, Lord, do you really know what you were doing? This whole act of creation. You took this terrible risk, and frankly, and her age wasn't much better. It was the age of the Black Death and the burnings. It wasn't a very good age, and she lived as an anchoress, a single woman, in a kind of tiny hut locked on a church, saying her prayers day and night. She said, Lord, do you really know what you're doing? Because the risks are huge. And the Lord said two things to her. First of all, he came as a human being to show us that there's no situation he's asked us to deal with that he himself will not take on board. And also he bears the weight, he lifts the load. All the mess we make of it, he carries. But then he says it's even more exciting than that. There comes a bit I don't really understand. And it's to do with some kind of inversion. He said, I tell you, on the last day, you'll be as pleased as I am. Because the very worst things will be turned inside out and they'll become the very best things. It's a bit like, after 4 years of broadcasting, the thing I remember most that brings me to tears is the very worst thing of this woman nearly being burned to death. And it became almost the very best thing I ever heard. Can you see that? It's not easy to get, but once you've seen it, then when the rest of the world comes at you and says, I cannot believe in a God because there's so much suffering, and yet at the same time everyone is crying out for love, and when we find love, and love comes in a variety of different packages. The Greeks had 4 words for it. We need at least 4, maybe 8. But when we find love, we suddenly start to function as a human being. And all the other loves flow from God. They cut off from God. None of the other loves work. And this is the experience. My father in the Second World War was a shipmate, and a naval officer, and one of his shipmates got into trouble, and they were in hospital together. And the shipmates, they wasn't very badly burnt, but there were 2 of them together. And one of them had a very complicated private life, and he basically gave up, and he died of hopelessness. And the other man had hope, and he lived. And my father, seeing these 2 men in exactly the same medical circumstances, was just astonished and told me about the need for hope. Hope will keep you alive. But ask a scientist to define hope for you. You won't find that they can do it. The language, as I briefly tried to talk to Philip about, the language of the Christian faith is a language full of all the virtues that human beings need to keep going. There was a psychologist called William James, brother of Henry James. He wrote a marvelous book called Varieties of Religious Experience, because in America in the 1880s there was a kind of revival and some very weird stuff happened. And as an agnostic, secretly I think he was prone to be a believer, but he said he was an agnostic. And he gathered all this material together. And he said that the reason for treating some of it seriously was the effect it had on people's lives. It literally turned people around. It turned people inside out. And as you look through history, you discover that Christians are people whose most deep needs have been met. Our need for forgiveness, for significance, for sharing forgiveness, for love, and for purpose, when God gives it to us all. Well, it's all very well being a Christian, but if you're not a Catholic, you don't get enough of it, because much of my worldview was formed by, in the 1980s, when I went Bible smuggling behind the Soviet Union. Now, I know this sounds a little bit glamorous, and I'm telling it to you because of part B that follows. So I met some wonderful people who I organised some money collecting for Christians who were suffering. And then the person who'd organised the thing said, well, will you go and smuggle the Bible? So I did, because young men in their mid-20s think they're invulnerable. And if I had any idea of the trouble I was getting myself into, I would never have been so stupid and irresponsible. As it was, I got caught by the KGB a couple of times, and they gave me a hard time, and they were very unpleasant to me, and threatened to send me to prison for 20 years unless I gave them the names and addresses of the people I'd memorised and was going to see. Well, that's another story, and will take some time. It's quite interesting. And as was my journey to Prague, where I was taking in theological books, perhaps a bit less glamorous, but the reason I was doing it was because the experiment of Marxism had decided to crush the church. It's very interesting that whenever the aggressive left begins to get some muscle, its first target is always the church. Look at the Spanish Civil War. Look at what they did in Russia. It's always the church they go to first. And this is not because we're the best organisers or the most arsey and difficult people. It's because there's a kind of visceral, metaphysical hatred for what the church stands for. So in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, they took the long view. They decided if we prohibit all ordinations of priests, there'll be no mass. No priests, no mass, no church. They'll all just die out and go away. So the church went underground. This is important because we're going to have to go underground again. The church went underground and they began to ordain people, but they hadn't got any books. The books were all locked up and guarded very carefully. So people like me went to the gym for a few months and lifted some weights, so it looked like we weren't carrying books but underpants and underwear. And the rules were, you never let a taxi man pick your case up because he'll know it's not tourist stuff. So and then delivered the books to go-betweens that I never ever met again. There are Catholic priests I would like to meet and embrace and thank for their courage, and I wouldn't mind them buying me a pint of beer either for bringing them their books. We needed each other. I've never met them. We were never ever given real names or real addresses in case we were caught and pressure was put on us to betray our friends. And I have to say, I didn't understand how dreadful interrogation could be until it actually happened. And I very nearly broke, which again is really humiliating and frightening. However, that was what they did. You know what happened. The wall came down in 1989, and we all thought we'd live happily ever after. But there's a new communist revolution, because the words are changed, and we'll come to being a Catholic in a minute, but this new revolution is coming at us in different clothes. And it's closing down free speech, it's introducing thought crime, all the Orwellian stuff you see in Brave New World and 1984. It's making a bid straight for the church and all its teaching on sexuality and on marriage and silencing people. With the Catholic views I now hold on marriage and sex, I could not be employed in any of the jobs I've held throughout my lifetime. Not one. So we must take this seriously. If they're putting us out of work on the basis of thought crime, and they're stopping us talking in the public space and threatening to cancel us, then you can be serious. You can be sure that this is a very serious movement, and you'll notice that the people in public life either accommodate themselves or they get cancelled. To give you an example of this, there's a very nice woman called Professor Kathleen Stock. Kathleen's a very clever lesbian professor of philosophy. Kathleen was kind of my natural, I won't say enemy, but how would I describe her? She'd be the opposing voice in in faculty meetings. The number of Christian courses I tried to put on with Inklings, Lewis, Chesterton, Tolkien and so on, I got closed down by these opposing voices because, why, they're men, they're white, they're from Oxbridge, and spit on the floor, they're Christian. This is in a university which is supposed to be pursuing truth, banning these courses for these reasons. So Kathleen would have been my partisan voice there. Well, I left my university post in 2012 as I began to become a Catholic, because I knew I'd get sacked for believing that marriage should only be between a man and a woman. Imagine my amazement when Kathleen was driven out of the university 2 years ago as a TERF, as a trans-exclusionary reactionary feminist. Kathleen had fallen victim herself to the people who were going to come after me. I couldn't believe it. She was the poster girl for everything this radical university stood for. Well, if you think that the voracious left is so hungry and so vicious that it will take not just J.K. Rowling, but a poster girl, lesbian professor of philosophy, the kind of epitome of all that my university stood for in terms of its funny values, and sack her and not protect and set out to destroy her life, be sure the situation that we're facing as Catholics in a secular society is getting dangerous. It's a bit like the frog is being boiled. You know the story, you've heard it so many times. I've always thought of my journey to crossing the Tiber rather like a trapeze artist. So there I am on a trapeze up in the big top, just in this kind of mythical image. And I'd become a Catholic a long time ago in my mind, but you have to pay a price for being a Catholic. You have to be obedient. You have to be trusting. You have to join the church and surrender a certain amount of autonomy. Now, it's very nice being a Protestant, because frankly, you can believe what the heck you like. and nobody can hold you accountable for it. It's a great pleasure. Many of the bishops I work with believe what the heck they like, and nobody could ever hold them, because there are so many different ways of reading the Bible. And what's been incredible is to watch how reading the Bible has changed as an ethical exercise in the course of 20 or 30 years. That would be another, but quite interesting lecture. So my trapeze began to unravel, and I had, I suppose probably one of the stories you want to hear, or you should hear, is how that unraveling took place. And I'm sorry, because this sounds phobic. The things I'm going to say to you now, if you repeat them, will sound pretty unpleasant. But they aren't, in fact. It's just they've been put into context. So I've been writing some things about the coronation because I have strong views about interfaith activities. Simply because the other faiths have different gods, and they take people to different places. If you want to know why Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and the only way to the Father, nobody else invites you to go to the Father. Just think about it. Buddha's not going to take you to the Father. Muhammad won't take you to the Father. The Hindus won't take you to the Father. The Confucianists won't. Well, who will take you to the Father? Of course he's the way, the truth, and the life, and the only way. Nobody else will invite you to go there. So you can't have people praying to different images of God because they're going in different directions. Well, you may not believe in the Father, but you need to work out whether you do or not. Our civilization has based all the goodness that we've accumulated on the belief of the Father who can be known through the gift of his Son for the saving of his children. So I taught Islam, and I was reasonably well read in the Quran, and I used to hold interfaith conferences, and one day a friend of mine in about 2005 wanted to get off campus and leave the conference that we'd had. He's very eminent. I was the least eminent person there. The others were international figures. And he said, "Gavin, I'm going to slip away and not give my paper." He's an imam, very famous imam. I said, "Oh, please don't. People they've come to hear you." And he said, "Well, the thing is, it's very difficult to get off campus. And then my job in England is done now. I've been doing this stuff," he said, "for about 30 years. I don't need to do it anymore." I said, "What are you talking about?" "Well," he said, "England will be an Islamic republic in the time of my grandchildren." I said, "You're not serious. We've never spoken like this before." He said, "It will. I'm going to go now." And he left. Please make my excuses. Well, it was embarrassing enough, and I went and I Googled, and I just Googled demographics. And it's 2050, when in England, the Islamic, everybody else balance moves 51-49 in favour of the Muslims. You may even have seen on Twitter and other places large gatherings of Muslims at Eid, displaying themselves in numbers that no other community in our country does. In Eid, there are something like 80,000 Muslims under the age of 50 who gather in a big park in Birmingham. Do you know how many soldiers are on the British Army? It's about 60,000. I once was in Egypt at a conference, and a Coptic driver said to me, "You know what they're going to do. They're going to do to you what they did to us. They will outbreed you and take you over." We, the Christian Copts, were Christians in Egypt, and it took a while, but we've been now all this language is on the whole outlawed as right-wing, super-fascist, phobic, hate language. But I'm just talking about facts, not values. I've got lots of Muslim friends. I know that's the kind of way that people defend themselves, but just the facts. There's no doubt at all there will be more, if things don't change. Who knows what might happen? But if they don't change, in England there will be more Muslims than anybody else. In, what are we now, 23? So that's 27 years. I might even still be alive. I doubt it, but I might be. Some of you will be. So how does that matter? Well, it matters because what's happening is at the moment the left is beating up Christianity very badly indeed, taking away our rights, taking away our freedom of speech. There are moves now to ban home education for children. So you won't be able to even take your children out of school to educate them yourselves as they can in America. And my guess is, I don't know this for sure, we might talk about it, you may have better informed views than me, but my guess is that in the next 7 years we're going to increasingly experience the pressure from the state. Would you have believed 2 years ago that if you've been standing on a pavement in Birmingham and a policeman come up to you and said to you, "Excuse you, what are you doing?" and you said, "I'm praying," that you would have then been handcuffed and taken to the police station? Would you have believed that? I never would. I can still hardly believe it. And I know what the excuse, I know why they have buffer zones. I know how they've imported the whole fake American conflict culture, but it still happened. And the thing that depressed me most of all was watching the House of Lords debate as it went through the Lords. Nobody stood up. I mean, those Church of England bishops are going to have a lot to answer for on the last day, when our Lord says, why did you not defend the culling of my children in the womb? And secondly, why did you say nothing about freedom of speech and freedom of conscience on the streets that you have responsibility for and a place in the legislature? Why nothing? It might make you angry. It makes me very angry and very upset. Nothing. What treachery. Treachery to the children, treachery to you and me, treachery to democracy. It stinks. It's really bad. Nothing. And it's the thin end of the wedge. It will not stop with just buffer zones and abortion clinics. The abortion clinics were closed, for goodness sake. So there was no words at all were brought against this dreadful invasion of human privacy and of the human conscience. And why? Because there is no sense of the sacredness of the human person. And that, as Catholics, is what you bring to this struggle, to this struggle. Nobody else believes in the sacredness of the unborn or even the postborn. We live in a culture where people are weighed by their usefulness, and that's why one of the next dreadful debates we're going to have is on euthanasia and the disposability of people and the pressure placed on elderly people who don't want to take resources from their children and their grandchildren and who will, rather as an act of generosity, sidle off to a clinic where they can be euthanized to take the economic burden off their families. Of course they'll feel like that. How can you possibly resist that kind of pressure if you're a kind and good person? And what begins like a trickle will become a torrent. I got into trouble when I first discovered, it was in the middle of my radio program, someone was phoning in about abortion. And I wasn't interested, I knew nothing about it. I accepted all the dreadful feminist arguments without even bothering to inform myself. And so while she was prattling on, I Googled. I thought, well, at least let me know the number of terminations that we're talking about. This would have been 2005, maybe. And do you know what the number of terminations has been since the Abortion Act was brought in England and Wales? So it's a very resonant number. Now, I don't know whether you believe in life starting at conception or later on. You can believe what you like. But if you don't believe it starts at conception, you'll need to persuade me why you don't think so, because there's no other evidence for a kind of gradual approach. The common sense view would be it starts when the spark happens. And there is no evidence of that. So let's assume it's even possible, maybe it's just possible, they're human beings from conception. Do you know the number? It's 6 million. What does 6 million say to you? Well, to me it's Auschwitz. To me it's the Holocaust. And I said on the radio, oh my goodness, we've culled 6 million of our children. It's a Holocaust. I was on the director's carpet the next morning, and he said, if you ever say anything like that again, we will cut the programme in mid-flow, and you will never work for the BBC again. Well, as it happens, I did never work for the BBC again anyway, but luckily they didn't cut it in full throat. I became a Catholic as the Church of England began to give way to all the secularisation that this culture has been promoting. And the reason it mattered to me is I had seen what secular totalitarian utopianism looked like in the Soviet Union and in Czechoslovakia. And once I discovered about the Frankfurt School and this utopian plan B that comes from the left, which are the culture wars, and involved taking precious Christian generous words like diversity, inclusion and equality and turning them into something that means exactly the opposite, I realised that we have a very serious problem on our hands. And so the Church of England, having no magisterium, having no central authority, allowing everyone to read the Bible whatever they want, and being desperate to have accreditation from the society that it tried to serve. And you can understand the difficulty. I'm not wholly critical. If you're a state church, you've got this sort of symbiotic relationship with the state, and you want people to come back, well, you want to be nice, you want to make it possible. So you can see why they changed their teaching to make it a little bit easier to get people into church. But there comes a point when there's some things, if you change them, you turn them inside out, you turn them upside down. The great sin against the Holy Spirit, as I understand it, is called evil good and good evil. And really there comes a point where if you adopt the secular values that we have, it's something like that. Tucker Carlson, who I've just heard today has lost his program on Fox News, said in a YouTube video I saw the other day that the American political project until recently was two different parties, left and right, working out how to achieve a common good. Everyone knew what the common good was. It was prosperity, safety, good economies, good health, good education, pleasant places to live. It's just the left thought you got there one way and the right thought you got there another, and they would argue about it and kind of muddle their way through the democratic process. It's not a bad model for helping people live together. But he said, something's happened. We no longer are pursuing the common good in America. Why? Because what the powers that be want as their prime ethical goals are the wholesale continued destruction of our preborn children and abortion, and the castration of our teenagers. They say, what do you mean castration of the teenagers? The whole transgender thing is the castration of teenagers who've moved from being 0.02% of a population where people genuinely suffered from a horrible thing called gender dysphoria, to an exponential growth in thousands, a mental illness, a contagion, where people believe that the kind of peace of mind they need can be found if they could change their biology, though they can't change their biology. And what should the state do? What should the parents do? What should the community do to these very, very vulnerable people who are asking to have their life completely ruined? They should say, don't do this. We're going to set you a hurdle, a bar that's difficult to climb. What has our society done? It's lowered the bar until you can have it on almost any terms you like. How is that good? How is that in any way moral? And so now we have three death movements, so to speak. The castration of our teenagers, the oncoming euthanasia, which will oncome inexorably, and the death of our preborn. This, along with hate crime and attacks on freedom of speech and conscience. One of the reasons I'm a Catholic, a number of reasons. But first of all, I began to discover that what the Catholic Church taught was true. I came across the Eucharistic miracles, and having been fighting scientists for the whole of my life, and been slightly perplexed, as Philip will be if he ever comes across Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin, and Aquinas, and knowing how to choose between them, I was perplexed. I couldn't believe that the Eucharistic miracle in Buenos Aires in 1994 was taken to some of the top scientists, and they discovered living white cells in the bleeding host that were consistent with the same blood group at Lanciano and the Shroud, and this was repeated 5 times in other places, in Tixla in Mexico and in several places in Poland and Hungary I can't pronounce and remember. I thought, why isn't the Catholic Church telling people? They were always right. Hocus pocus, the mockery words that people use, taken from hoc est meus corpum, all the humiliation and the mockery of transubstantiation. We were right. It was true. The scientists tell us, why are you not telling people this? If you haven't read them up, don't let a late convert be the person who just read them. It's so extraordinary, I'm almost embarrassed when I tell people about it, but it's not for us to let the scientists tell people. It's their experiments, their machinery. It's completely astonishing. And then I discovered that I thought that the Anglo-Catholic clergy were fond of Mary because they had mother complexes they hadn't worked their way through. I'm so sorry. I know it sounds stupid, but you look for explanations. We're all looking for kind of, you have to find some whys, and you start off with really bad ones. And hopefully, if you've got any energy and integrity, you don't stop asking questions until you drop some of your more stupid solutions. It was only when I discovered the apparitions of Our Lady, particularly, as in my case, the unauthorized as yet one at Gavin, that I became astonished at the fact that, like Elijah and like Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration, Our Lady has been, and like Cana, Our Lady has been involving herself in the life of the church right the way down the centuries. There's some very critical points. My favourite one is in about the 4th century in Syria, when there's a rather demoralised, depressive Syrian bishop who would actually turn out to be really quite successful and famous for sorting out some heresy in a council and evangelising Syria, very enthusiastic. But he came to one of those crisis moments and sat down and put his head in his hands and said, I can't go on. And then St. John and Our Lady appear to him, Eusebius writes it up, and tells him to cheer up. Well, if Our Lady appears and tells us to cheer up, I'm ready to say cheer up. Nothing would cheer me up more than that. He did cheer up. And the rest of his life was profoundly geared to serving the church in the most effective way. But it's not just that. It's all that we have from Pope Leo XIII's vision of what was going to come in the last 100 years that we've been through, and the astonishing gift that the various children have had as they've conveyed a message to the grown-ups to get their act together for the love of Christ. That's all it really is. Just get your act together. Do what you're supposed to. Say your prayers. Get on your knees. Repent. Don't buy into the false hopes and the twisted truths of the people around you, because they're not true. So I'm delighted to be a Catholic. I mean, there are other reasons too. There is no magisterium, the authority of the Catholic Church. Its capacity for making saints, its capacity for changing lives, its vision of holiness, its religious orders. There's a very interesting writer called, see, I'm getting old and names disappear. Who's the man who wrote, Peter Ackroyd, thank goodness. Peter Ackroyd noticed that 85% of all the literature on ghost stories comes from English writers. So there's a number of ghost stories all the way from around the world. Why on earth would 85% of it be written by the English? Well, he thinks it's because in the destruction of the monasteries and our loss of our access to our ancestors in God and through the prayers of the religious, that this provided such a dreadful terminus ad quem for a civilized society that the English never recovered from it. And so they're longing for the kingdom of heaven, the communion of saints, a living relationship with our mothers and fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, went through a kind of odd subversion process and came up as an over-fascination with the living dead as ghosts, since they have no access to them, as the living dead as saints. Well, it's an idea. It's the most cogent reason I can think of. But the reason I offer it to you is because I think this murdering of abbots from towers who refuse to give in, this stealing of all the property and this distribution to the moneyed classes of the day, and the deprivation of people in my country of the prayers of people who were called to be religious, upon whose energy and commitment, the spiritual life of the rest of the church, so much depends. Nothing happens without prayer. The whole economy of what we do as Christians is based on, if we don't pray, there is no wind. It's like sailing boats and harbours. If there's no wind, they don't work. If there's no prayer, Christians don't work. The church doesn't work. And the gift of the religious was to make sure that some prayer happened that wouldn't otherwise. And in England, it was just wiped out completely. But I think what's happening in England now is that, I think God says, I'm going to offer you Jesus and the sacredness of the human person, where people are untouchable because they're made in my image, and the laws and the culture and the customs reflect that. But if you don't want it, there are other people who will replace these laws and customs with very different views of the worth of the human being. And neither Islam nor the new utopians are very kind to human beings. They're less generous. People are less sacred in all the other philosophies. The Catholic Church, undoubtedly, if you look at the prophecy of Pope Benedict or of those extraordinary words of Cardinal George, we're about to face a really difficult time. Well, the Lord has given us the privilege of defending his church in a hard time. That's a great privilege. He must trust us. He must think that we can do something for him. But it's not just for us. The church is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. But the people around us desperately need what the Catholic Church teaches and has always taught. And wherever it teaches it, people flourish. I'll finish with one final story because I think it sums it up beautifully. In the 1980s, there was some programs about the Borgias. You remember the Borgias? Very naughty people. They got up to some terrible stuff. And then this BBC program, it was all produced in lurid technicolor in great detail. And it was another hammer in the nail of faith and belief in the Catholic Church, as people who didn't know any better thought this was the only history. The presentation of Galileo is terrible. If anyone's, Philip, read what really happened to Galileo, okay? Because the stuff they tell you in school, it's all a lie. He fell out with a bad-tempered pope, that's all. It had nothing to do with heliocentrism at all. But there's part of the propaganda that they tell people about the obscurantism of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has been at the forefront of all science, always. Of course there have been arguments about it. That's what science is. It depends on falsification. Why should there not be arguments? But the idea that we're anti-intellectual or anti-science is simply a dreadful travesty of truth. And so they put on the Borgias, and it was dreadful. It was very hard for Catholics to bear it in those times. I remember thinking badly of the Catholic Church myself at the time. And then I came across a little lady who somehow made it onto the media. And she'd chosen this moment to become a Catholic. And everyone said, have you not seen the Borgias? And she said, yes, I have. Yes, it's rather rude. And, well, how could you possibly become a Catholic? Well, she said, because I looked at the Church of the Borgias and I thought, gosh, that's a decadent institution without any hope. That's completely rotten to the core. Nothing can save that. And then the other day I saw a documentary on Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And I watched her pulling babies out of garbage tins that nobody else would touch, and feeding the most destitute and caring for the most vulnerable, and making a little town, a little city of the most rejected people in the world that nobody else wanted to. My heart wept with relief, and I thought, there has to be a God. Any God, anyone who could move the church from what the Borgias did and still produce Mother Teresa of Calcutta is a very, very powerful God indeed. And that's actually the trajectory that we're called upon as the Catholic Church to meet. We have to take our culture, which is now behaving like the Borgias, actually it's making the Borgias look pretty moderate, and we have to be able to produce a civilization where people like Mother Teresa, where she's not the only one pulling discarded human beings out of the rubbish bins, because she's reflecting the love of God who made us all. And this requires courage and an ethical responsibility. There is no other religious organization in the world that does this or sees humanity like this. Only the Catholic Church. I'm very glad to have crossed the Tiber. We have a privileged vocation together, and we have lots of work to do in the next 10 or 20 years. Thank you very much.
there's a young man here he has been volunteered, shall we say, to be the microphone man. And Philip is going to ask the first question as well. There you go, Philip.
So, kind of unrelated to the talk, but I would like to ask this about Lewis's argument for Christianity, his trilemma from the book Mere Christianity, which is obviously, he argued that Christianity is true because our Lord was either a Lord, liar, or lunatic, and he rules out the other two options, and he's left with the option that Christ is Lord. So I would like to ask, do you think personally that this is a good argument for Christianity?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, it's quite a good argument, because what he doesn't do is he misses something out he should have admitted to. Much of the one of the reasons why a lot of people don't deal with this trilemma, if you may have heard, if you come to the Gospels, Lewis thinks you only have three possible reactions to who Jesus is, and that he intended you only to have three reactions. He's either not telling you the truth, and he's really a very successful con man, or he's mad, or he is who he says he is. And Lewis is a philosopher, and this is a neat way of looking at it, and in fact it's really hard to think of what any other alternatives are. In fact, there is one more alternative which he doesn't put in front of people, but which most people resort to, and that is that you can't believe the records. So the records have been falsified. You can't believe the Gospels. And in my lifetime, when I started studying theology, after I initially trained as a lawyer, I was astonished at the impact that German higher criticism had, certainly on the Protestants, but also on the Catholic community. Until I became an academic myself, and then I understood what the academic game was. The academic game is to prove you're cleverer than anybody else, and to overthrow the established order with a really clever, insightful, a variation, I suppose. In other words, you have to bring the established order down if you're an academic. So if you're going to be a Bible scholar, well then what you need to do is to invent a theory that no one's ever thought of. And since all the orthodox theories have already been thought of, it's got to be heterodox. And so the academy is not only for that reason, but also because, one of the things that's happened over the last 300 years is there's been an increasing degree of anti-authoritarian skepticism, particularly coming from the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and the fact that people are all told that their own judgment is as good as anybody else's, where actually most of our judgments aren't. So the combination of academics trying to be destructively clever and make a name for themselves, and the fact that people on the ground were really quite ready to hear these things, and also, if you can rubbish the New Testament, then you get to do what you like. I actually think that most of my atheist colleagues are atheists because they want to quieten their consciences over their sexual and ethical conduct, and they don't want anyone to tell them how they should live. And secretly, it's not really about whether they believe in God at all. It's a kind of libertarian, leave me alone. And if I can get rid of the idea of God...
Well spoken.
Sorry?
Well spoken.
Well, thank you. Well, but I wasn't sure if you were coughing and sneezing. All positive heckling, very welcome. So I don't take atheists at face value because I think their motivation's a bit skewed. But the fact is there are a number of apologists who say that the New Testament documents are utterly unique, and in the end it's for us to decide. I'm astonished at the difference between the New Testament documents and the Gnostic Gospels that follow them. So, ever from AD 100 onwards, there were a whole load of alternative interpretations, representations of some of the Gospel stuff, of which, in fact, the Quran is a kind of late derivative. And when you read them, you think, who would believe this stuff? This is ridiculous. I make an exception for something like the Proto-Evangelium of St. James, which was written about AD 80, which talks about Our Lady's childhood. I'm a huge fan of it. I read it and I think, this does something to my insides. Well, I can't tell you how to tell an authentic document from another one, but that's how I do it. If If it sparks my heart and it doesn't offend my brain, then I give it some space, and then I go looking at it further. But I'm just astonished at the New Testament. I'm astonished at its power, its vivacity. It's not, I kept on telling my students that when it comes to some books, it's not that we read them, but they read us. Well, the book that reads us most of all is the New Testament. We have no right to sit in judgment on us. We have no right to sit in judgment. It reads us. And most of the people who rubbish it haven't read it. They haven't sat down and given it the time that such an important book deserves. So, Lewis doesn't deal with that, but most people escape God by saying, I don't think I can trust the documents. If you do trust the documents, well then I think Lewis is right, because well, quite clearly Jesus isn't a liar. What would be in it for him to do that? Why lie? There's no money, there's no sex, and there's no power. And on the whole, most people lie only for those reasons. There are a few pathological liars, but they soon display themselves on what they are. And he does seem to be going around telling the truth. In fact, people get cross with him for telling the truth. So it's really not likely he's a liar. And then if he's a madman, he's the cleverest madman you ever met, because his words have resonated down through history. They've set people free. They've given people profound insights. You find endless hundreds of thousands of people who say these words were life-giving to me. Well, I've met lots of madmen. I've been afraid of becoming one myself. But their words don't give life to people. They cause confusion. So what are we left with? If the records are reliable and he is telling the truth and he's not mad, well, then he's left to taking him at face value. Now, Lewis doesn't say you have to submit to him as Lord, but if you take him at face value, well, he never lets you go. He's huge. I mean, he's everything. He's intimate. He's powerful. He's healing. He's kind. Above all, he's forgiving. He's non-judgmental, non-condemnatory. He's the most interesting person in the whole of human literature. And on this human person, and everything we value has been built. All the music, and the architecture, and the stories, and the intelligence, and the quest. It's all built on his personality and who he was. Because one of the things Christianity brought to the table that allowed science to happen was that the world was reliable and you could trust it. The only reason that Dawkins has a career in science is because the world did as it was told. There's a very interesting author called Charles Williams who says, we take things for granted too much. What if every time you went up to a door handle, you couldn't be sure whether it would give you an electric shock or dissolve and become water? Things behave. And it's because they behave that we can deal with the world and then control it. So I think, I don't understand how anybody reading the Gospels with an open mind can do anything but just be bowled over by Jesus. And then it's very hard not to love him, because he loves us, and that's how we're made. Our hearts are restless. You've made them for yourself, and they're restless until they find themselves in you. So I think Lewis was right. It's great. Could you mind carrying it round?
What is that? He's not going to take many questions if he's...
Someone wave a hand. And then could you carry it back?
First of all, congratulations, Dr. Gavin, on following up the footsteps of Cullinan and you. But when I was Philip's age, our lovely curate said to us lads, it's okay if you believe in Adam and Eve, or it's okay if you believe we evolved from apes, right? So, as life progressed, I'm more inclined to go completely with the book of Genesis, and, that we all descended through the lineage of a woman, through one Earth Mother in Central Africa. And I don't know whether this connects with it, but at one time Jesus said, I seen Satan fall like lightning from heaven. So that goes back to the fall, Satan and his angels. So I don't know whether you have any thoughts on enlightening me on that one.
Thanks.
Oh, you're allowing me to dig such a hole for myself. Thank you, Philip. Does anyone here know of Anne Catherine Emmerich?
Yes.
Okay, well that's good, thank goodness. So, I mean, first of all, the DNA stuff's very interesting. It really does look like it goes back to a single source, doesn't it? The scientists tell us. We don't. They keep on changing the bit of Africa we're supposed to have started in. So I don't think we can take. These are hypotheses they're telling us, not facts, except that it does look like the DNA goes back to a single source. And evolution is not as fixed as people say it is. I'm not an anti-evolutionist. I think evolution is a very clever way to develop things. But I'm not a scientist, and so I really don't know. So I sidestep this in two ways. I think they're both legitimate. I mean, the first is I really actually don't care how my DNA got to me. It doesn't matter a huge amount to me. But I think the book of Genesis is almost next to the Gospels the most profound book I've ever read, because it presents us with the human dilemma, which is that just because you're able to do something, can you live with the consequences of doing it? It seems to me what eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is about. And the answer is, no, you can't. And so the rest of the Bible flows from that. But to my mind, intellectually, in terms of asking why, that's the most important thing. I mean, there are lots of other interesting things we can take from it. But I was also very intrigued when I read Anne Catherine Emmerich for the first time, because I thought I liked the way in which she suggests that. Well, first of all, theologically, you're quite right. The earth is not a neutral place, as Rousseau and all his intellectual descendants tell us. This is not a blank slate. The book of Revelation tells us indeed that after this metaphysical war, this is where the bad angels, this is Borstal for bad angels. So it's both, Lewis talks about being an occupied country, it's both exquisitely and incredibly beautiful, but it's a place where some bad stuff goes down. Let's use the word stuff rather than what the Americans say. Anyway, bad stuff goes down on Earth. This is not a neutral territory, morally neutral. That's the first thing. Emmerich has the idea that the Garden of Eden was a kind of protected place where something miraculous happened with Adam and Eve. But there are other hominoids and a whole load of evolutionary stuff out there. And when the moment of sin came, like the glass, the bubble that surrounds this theological experiment that was the garden, it dissolves. And Adam and Eve are Adam and Isha, mankind, humankind and companion. And their names are generic too, so although we think of them as personal, we can also think of them as mythological and or archetypal. Again, it doesn't really matter to me because I see Adam and Eve in everything we are and we do anyway. So they can equally be historical people or mythological people. It makes no difference to me at all. It's about what they stand for. But with Emmerich says, well, they lose the protection of the bubble, and out they are with the other humanoids, and then there's a degree of crossbreeding. Did you know, it's rather funny, did you know who the only people are who, let's get this right, we all have a degree of Neanderthal DNA in us. The only people who don't, do you know, this is so funny if you grew up in the South African era, do you know who the only people who do not have Neanderthal DNA are? Okay, they're the black Africans in South Africa. They're the only true human beings. Just enjoy that for a moment when you think of what the whites did to the blacks in South Africa, all the way through the apartheid years in the 70s, 80s. So, the clever whites, some percentage Neanderthal, attack the local native blacks because they're subhuman. They were the only humans. It's quite funny, really. So there was, anyway, so there's obviously been some intermingling with Neanderthals. I have no idea when it happened, but because I'm not a very good scientist, and I'm much more interested in the why questions, because the why questions get perennially presented. The way in which we live society now, the whole technological revolution, and the way it's going so very badly wrong, is predicated on the insight just because you have the ability to do this. Can you live with the consequences? That seems to me to be what we should be bringing to people out of the first couple of chapters of Genesis, because anything else is kind of second order. So I can't really help you with the science, but I think the theology is endlessly interesting.
Sorry, could I just?
Yes, please. Do you know better?
No, it's just that a little girl went to her mother once wondering about how she came to be. So the mother gave her the biblical account of the creation of humanity, and then she went to her dad, and the dad said, well, no, we're we're descended from apes and gorillas. The girl was confused, went back to her mum and said, "Mum said, oh, well, Daddy was talking about his side of the family." Just in a little while, I'm going to pass around just a sheet. If you would like to be at the next Cafe Theology, just to write your email, if you would do that. Thank you very much. If you put up your hand, and here's Philip. Here you go.
Hi, Gavin. Just more of curiosity, more so than anything. Since your conversion now to Catholicism, have you any desire to continue your vocation as an ordained Catholic priest? You know, given, I suppose, like what John Henry Newman did when he converted, you know, obviously he went back and had to do some studies in the seminary. Have you any desires for that, or do you think you're comfortable enough the way you are at the moment?
This is a very difficult and embarrassing question. So the answer is yes. I thought I was called to be a priest. I mean, if I hadn't been, I'd have enjoyed being a lawyer, which I thought I ought to be in the first place. I'm only a priest because I got strong-armed, albeit into the Anglican priesthood, which is isn't quite the same. But since I became a Catholic in 2019, lots has changed, and I've kind of had to catch up with the plot. God's timing is not accidental, and I think the fact I've taken a long time to become a Catholic, which I lament, is also simply part of the plan. The problem is I'm often say, because it's such a useful insight, I think Søren Kierkegaard said that, well, lots of people have said it, but it sounds better if you quote him, that we live our lives forwards, but we only understand them looking backwards. One of the things that's happened since even 2019 is that the capacity to speak out into the public arena is becoming increasingly restricted, and within the Catholic Church, if you're a bishop, well, if you're the Pope, then you've got views about what your bishops say in public, and if you're a bishop, you'll have views about what your clergy say in public. And so, as the odds get more intensely stacked against us, it's quite an advantage not having somebody say to me, "You can't say that." So one of the things that became clearer was, perhaps from people who thought I was a bit too noisy and disruptive. After all, I'd already upset the Queen once. Well, I didn't really upset her, I upset the Lord Chamberlain. But I think perhaps there's always a tension between the priestly and the prophetic. We very badly need them both. And we certainly badly need more priests. If anyone here is thinking of a priest, keep on praying. We need you. We need the Mass so very badly. And I miss being able to celebrate Mass enormously. But just at the moment, there's a need for people who will be able to speak out in the public space. And I think by sending me to a really arsey, left-wing, pretty brutal, radical university, God gave me a certain amount of training, or at least experience, of representing him in the public square. And perhaps I'm being more faithful by doing that, and maybe then I have to give up saying Mass. That might be the price for it, so that I don't embarrass people whose responsibility is to keep a fairly tight hold on the ship. It's not easy directing an institution, and it requires a lot of wisdom. So maybe I'm doing people a favour by staying in what I hope is a faithful but obedient lay state. If the Holy Spirit decides something else, I'm sure he'll let me know. But meanwhile, that's the present situation. Thank you.
Well done.
No, Dr. Gavin, thanks very much for your presentation. Just a quick thing, I just listened to your words online here tonight, and your vocabulary and your power being able to so eloquently express important ideas in the culture and the church. Probably you can see why the Lord left it until maybe around these kind of years for you to cross the Tiber in one sense, because we do need that voice, very much so in our culture and in the church. Just one thing I'd like to pick up on, and listen to one of your recent videos online, and hear you here this evening again, about the future almost of Catholicism in Ireland and England, etc. And you spoke about a quasi, almost monastic vision for it going forward. It's something that Bishop Robert Barron picked up as well when he came here in 2018 to the World Meeting of Families. And I'd just like to ask, would you mind expanding that for us for a few moments?
Yes.
Your thoughts on the piece. Thank you.
Well, Thank you. But once again, you're asking me to talk beyond my expertise. But insofar, I remember I surprised myself. I was on a radio show and somebody said, just for a moment, Gavin, imagine you are the Archbishop of Canterbury and he actually has real power. What's the one thing you would do for the Church's behalf? I've always been really interested in what they call the Dark Ages. I'm a great fan of St. Martin, and I think I'm about to become a fan of St. Patrick. And yes, well, it's about time. Has anyone here read The Dream of the Rood? It's an Anglo-Saxon poem about the death of Christ. And the thing about the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, they were really brutal. They were hardcore, pathological, murdering people. I'm sorry, most of them were your ancestors, so your side of the family. And they found it very difficult indeed to accept I mean, their God was Thor. And they found it very difficult indeed to accept a different God. But they did on two grounds. So first of all, in the Dream of the Rood, you have a heroic, victorious Jesus who climbs the cross. And the poem tells the experience from the point of view of the cross, as if the cross was alive, and what it's like to have the King of Glory, the great warrior who won, climbing upon him to embrace each other. It's an incredible poem, it's really beautiful. But we have a kind of, it's so opposite to the insipid Victorian Jesus meek and mild that doesn't do anybody any good at all. And the reason he's like that is because St. Martin and St. Patrick presented a very powerful Jesus, not powerful in the sense of controlling, but powerful in the sense of having the authority to demand our allegiance and also to ask us to do very difficult things that took enormous courage. And that's always been the case. And the people who did those difficult things and with enormous courage were mainly monastics. And so, and I'm sure everyone here knows as much about the monastic history of Western Europe as I, more than I do. But two things happened. First of all, they saved civilization partly through what they learnt and what they did and how they prayed. But I mean, they were at the centre of the whole social services system. They were, if you like, the engine in the car of Christianity. And so powerful were they that, I mean, they simply converted some very angry, brutal people who lived in these islands, these Western Isles, the Atlantic Western Isles. That was a heck of a thing to do, really, fantastically brave. And so what I think as society is breaking down, as we lose the family, we lose the community, we enter into this kind of non-person society which Huxley and Orwell are both terrifyingly foretold. Christian community may be the antidote to this, and the best kind of Christian community, I think the purest kind, is the monastic kind. And so, if I was the Archbishop, and I looked at the way in which society is ungluing and falling to pieces and poisoning itself with confusion and untrustworthiness, I think I would want as many religious in my diocese as possible. First of all, to do the heavy lifting, to do the praying. Praying is very difficult. I find whenever I try and pray, something kind of puts me off, always, just always. I used to think it was my immoral character, but I'm beginning to think it's just a headwind. So don't let be put off praying, but at the same time, the religious are very good at not being put off that, because they know what the score is. That's what they signed up to do. So I don't know what I mean, what I do know is that Europe, the light is going out in Europe. The church has lost confidence. People sometimes say, "What do you think you can bring to the Catholic Church?" And I say, "Well, I'd like to bring hope and confidence." But I'm so impressed at what many of you have gotten so used to what the church stands for that there's that lovely phrase that whoever first discovered the water bottled the fish, because they're in it all the time. So the people perhaps are most overjoyed about Catholicism maybe convert Catholics, because you've been in it so long, you take it for granted. But from the outside, it's truly wonderful. And you just have to be in a community that has no idea what it's doing, what its ethics are, what its doctrine is, what the responsibilities are, to live in that kind of anarchic over subjective existentialism to understand what a joy it is to have the majesty. You know, authority is a pain, but on the other hand, it's a structure that keeps us from dissolution and from madness. So I think that, first of all, I should say that in Russia, some extraordinary things have happened to the faith. When I went into Russia in 1982, there were virtually no Christians. I mean, handfuls of faithful people losing their jobs, losing healthcare, being sent to prison for their belief in Christ. Some wonderful Baptists. But I mean, in terms of the population, 0.0 something something. Do you know how many people identify as Orthodox Christians today? Just put the whole Ukrainian conflict at the back of your mind for a moment and don't hear the word Russia as a bad word. Do you know what percentage of the Russians, since the wall came down, now say they're believing Orthodox Christians? It's over 70. How do you get 70% of the population says, however inadequately saying it, it's really a miracle. And of course Our Lady said this would happen, so we shouldn't be surprised. And in China, you know the figures, they're just enormous. And in Africa, the only place where we're really going down is here in America, and we know why, because we've become completely decadent. And the secular decadence is poisonous to the human spirit. So we're the kind of rear guard of civilization. And certainly if the church does suffer badly and get wiped out, well, it's up to the Lord to bring it back, but he jolly well did in Russia. So, that ought to give us some hope. But meanwhile, I think praying communities, both formally monastic and formally religious, and maybe even kind of semi-monastic, places of refuge where people can spend some time sorting themselves out and learning the discipline of prayer and the spiritual life. I don't see why one shouldn't have kind of first-class religious and second-class religious. I'd have third and fourth-class religious too, I think. Just because we need these communities where we can learn and become better Christians and live out the discipline of the Christian spiritual economy. I'm sorry, it's not a very good answer, but those are just some random thoughts about that. Yes. Philip, can I do your job for you?
First of all, I would like to apologize because English is not my native language. I speak Spanish, but I will try my best.
Hola.
Well, my question is regarding Islam.
Yes. Oh gosh.
Yes. I watched a video recently where there was a conference in Pakistan. And some ulemas, they were a very important ulema who was in charge of the conference. He was crying. He was crying because of the amount of Muslims who are leaving Islam. And there is a very famous YouTuber or influencer who is Ali Dawah, and he has been reported that just in the United States, 50,000 Muslims are leaving Islam. Now, there are certain key figures in this, which is, for example, Al-Fadi, who is a Saudi Arabian scholar, who is now a Protestant, and he has Sira International, and he explains the true origins of Islam. He's a full Arab, but he's a Protestant. There is also David Wood, a very famous Protestant, and there are a couple of more who I personally follow because they are very interesting characters. The thing is, the Catholic Church, so far, I haven't seen anyone who is Catholic and who is trying to who are so courageous, because in that video in Pakistan, there are 200 people, including Al-Fadi, who has been issued a death penalty. And I've only heard somebody contacted me and told me there is a priest who is Moroccan, and he is a priest, and he left Islam, but he's not willing to face. I haven't seen so far any Catholic, and unfortunately here in Ireland I've heard some priests even saying that the Catholic Church is very inclusive and accept Islam.
Sorry, what?
The Catholic Church is very inclusive. Inclusive, and we see that we also help our Muslim brothers. And then I was wondering if I should give them from now on my money to the mosque instead of the church. It's all the same. And this is really, this ecumenism is really problematic in my mind, because I see, on the other hand, Protestants doing the hard work, and also atheist Muslims, as some. But then I don't see the Catholic Church, on the other hand, is telling me we are inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, there are so many things one could pick up there. I think the first thing I'd like to say is to be a bit of a spoil sport and say we have to be quite careful with anecdotal evidence. People say, I've heard someone say, and not because it may not be true, it might be, but what we need is to know what we're talking about. I was very moved when I went on a pilgrimage with a man who was a child of a Hamas leader and was a militant Muslim and arrested in prison, and he became a Christian because Jesus appeared to him in prison. So I know him, he's told me a story, I cried buckets, I've got a video of it, it's just extraordinary. There's lots of anecdotal evidence that's similar to that, where a lot of Muslims are having dreams of Jesus and Jesus is coming to them. There's some hard evidence I know about underground Christians in Iraq who are Muslims by day and Christians by night. So by day they fulfill the requirements of the community, by night they meet for Bible study and for the Eucharist. So all respect to them. The difficulty is that Islam is such a complex religion that it's quite hard to make generalizations about it. I think Our Lady's on record at Medjugorje for saying that one of the holiest people in Croatia was a Muslim woman who prayed. But again, that may be anecdotal. It was put to me by somebody who thought that would be helpful. What you've described as inclusive is really just a form of contemporary relativism that's infecting the whole of our society. The problem with the culture wars, I didn't talk about it, there wasn't time. I didn't even tell you why I had to resign from the Queen, but I got diverted in my head, I'm sorry. But it was about Islam. It was about, I protested because an Anglican dean took out St. Paul from an Epiphany Eucharist and replaced it with a reading from the Quran, which was read by a practicing Muslim in Arabic, and it was a surah that denies the divinity of Jesus. So I thought this was really terrible. But, just in brackets, so charged has our public discourse become that we can't talk about Islam in public without being described as Islamophobic, or even more stupidly racist, as if all Muslims came from one race, which they so obviously don't. So first of all, one of our problems is we can't talk about it without being accused of a hate crime. Secondly, there are very, very many different kinds of Islam. Thirdly, Islam is quite hard to grasp for Christians because it's not a religion, essentially. It's a mixture, it's a hybrid between a political way of being and a religion. And the problem is, in a kind of semi-postmodern way, sometimes when you ask it religious questions, you get a political answer, and sometimes when you ask it political questions, you get a religious answer. And sometimes when you get a religious answer, you get one from the beginning of the Quran, which is awfully nice and quite generous, and sometimes you get them from the end of the Quran, which is not nearly as nice and generous. But the problem is there's a theology of abrogation, which means that if there's a conflict between the nice ones and the nasty ones win. And that's why there are no moderate Muslims winning the battle of how Islam presents itself in the public space. Because all the militants just have to quote from the more violent end of the Quran, and they win the theological argument. You don't see any moderate Muslims in the public space saying, this is how you can be a good Muslim. Because they're always trumped by the part of the Quran that was written in Medina rather than in Mecca. So we have to be very careful making generalizations about Islam, because already in the last minute I hope I've suggested that we have all these variables written in. I, should you give your money to a mosque? What we need, the other thing we have to say, and many people don't know, is that although Allah is a Middle Eastern phrase for father, the Allah of the Quran and Yahweh in the Hebrew Christian scriptures is a completely different person. In fact, Isa in the Quran and Jesus in the Gospels are completely different. Miriam, Our Lady in the Quran and Our Lady in the Gospels is completely different. So we have a problem here that Muslims tell you that they recognize our figures, but they don't. They've invented different figures who resemble the historic figures of our faith by poor nominal association only. So that's another complication. And the trouble is, all the people who are kind of given to relativism, thinking, well, wouldn't it be nice if everything was equal, don't understand what Islam is or the nature of the Quran. So one of the things we have to say to Muslims is that if what kind of God would you like to believe in? And the fact is that our Lord Yahweh, the Father of the Holy Trinity, is a really very, very appealing and wonderful relationship to have. It's much nicer than Allah, who is a bit brutal, and whom you can't know anyway. You're not allowed to know God as a Muslim. He's utterly unknowable. So there is no intimacy, there is no relationship. And I'm very fond of Sufism, and I came, my interest in Islam through Sufism and its kind of hybrid bridge. But Islam is very different. The mistake that our culture makes is assuming that the religion Islam is a kind of Arabic version of Judeo-Christianity. And it just absolutely is not. And so you need to treat it for what it is. Now, why would I rather our culture was Christian than Islamic? Well, because we don't throw gays off buildings. We don't execute people for leaving the faith. We don't use terror and power to force people to keep prescribed rules. There is a kind of authoritarian, totalitarian muscle in Islam. And if you like religion like that, you're very welcome to be a Muslim. But one of the reasons why I'm a Christian evangelist is because I want to introduce people to Jesus and the Holy Trinity. The Holy Spirit is utterly wonderful. Our Lord Christ is utterly, utterly wonderful. And the Father is utterly, utterly wonderful. Why would one want a Middle Eastern autocrat of pathological tendencies as your God? People should have a choice. But at the moment, we're not allowed even to talk about like that in the public square, because the left has told us that to do so is Islamophobic and it's a thought crime. There are some wonderful Muslims. There are some Muslims who meet Jesus, and we have to always distinguish between Muslims, between people, and Islam. And usually, on these occasions, particularly in the public square, I say I don't want to compare Christianity and Islam, because it's impossible. I'm not qualified to do it above anything else. I'm hardly qualified to compare Christianity, which is immensely complex and wonderful down the ages. And I'm certainly not qualified, even though I know a little bit, to Islam. So what I try and do is say, can we please talk about Jesus and Muhammad? Then you can talk about real things. You can talk about two real ways of being, of religious leadership. Muhammad wasn't the Messiah, but he acted in a messianic way. And so the best way I find, in case you find yourself wanting to have conversations with Muslims or with other relativistic Christians, is say, let's not please talk about the systems. It's too complex. We're not well enough educated. That's not rude. That's just, we're not. But let's talk about Jesus and Muhammad. I mean, do any of you know that for all the Chinese whispers, they say, well, you can't rely on the Gospels because they were written too late after the life of Jesus. And in fact, they were almost certainly written within 25 or 30 years. Do you know how long it took for the Quran to emerge after the death of Muhammad? 200 years. 200 years of oral history. And there are huge issues about the reliability and whether or not the Muhammad in the Quran had very much to do with the historical Muhammad. Just in the same way they used to tell us that the Jesus in the Gospels had very little to do with the real Jesus, but had been invented by a community of faith to meet some of their needs. It was all completely ludicrous. But because these people spoke with authority and had PhDs, people believed them. So for the moment, let's just restrict ourselves to comparing Jesus and Muhammad and let people make a choice. It's quite simple, and I think it works very well. Nobody beats Jesus. Yes.
Thanks so much for an very interesting talk. My question just relates to education and civic society. And you spoke about the difficulties of working in an atheistic, secularized, third-level university. And we're not optimistic that that will change in the short term. With things like homeschooling becoming popular for Catholic parents, with Catholic students choosing non-state secular universities, I was just thinking what dangers that presents for us as Catholics. How can we, as Catholics, participate faithfully in civic society and still maintain our Catholic values and not simply kind of morph into a sect?
Well, I feel on confident ground because I know something about this, thank goodness. But can I introduce this by telling you a story? Are any of you familiar with what happened at a school in South Croydon in Purley about a year ago when an erotic poem was produced? Any of you, could you wave your hand if you know anything about it? Well, can I tell you a bit about it, because I think it sets an agenda that we, in a very particular way, that we need to deal with. So, in South London, in a Catholic state school in Purley, the head of English, who had been at Cambridge, had a friend of his who'd been his male lover, and despite the fact he was head of English in a Catholic college, allegedly asked his male lover to come and give some readings to their prepubescent Catholic boys. And so the poet from Cambridge came with a poem, and I'm really sorry to do this to you, but I can't avoid telling you the truth. He wrote an erotic poem about the grooming of a young man discovering the erotic delights of homosexuality, which he interweaved with the Lord's Prayer. And it was so disgusting, it's just awful. What happened after that was that some parents complained to the bishop, and the Archbishop of Suffolk, and the Archbishop took an interest, and a conflict arose. And the astonishing thing is that half the Catholic governors of this school were in favour of the homoerotic grooming poem, because they were LGBT++ supportive, okay? And the other half weren't, so it was a stalemate. It's very difficult to get Catholic teachers in England to teach in Catholic schools. You have to sign up saying you're sympathetic. But well over half the teaching staff were angry with the Archbishop, were in favour of the homoerotic grooming poem, and went on strike. And well over half the parents were also LGBT+ QQ friendly, and they supported this piece of blasphemy, which left half the governors, less than half of the teachers, and some of the parents, and then there was a fight. Well, as it happened, I was able to write a bit about it, and partly by stooping to having to quote some of the poem, which was utterly disgusting. The Catholic community grew in courage and determination. The bishop sacked the recalcitrant governors and replaced them, as he was entitled to do by law. The unions all around the country took this as a test homophobic case, and were on strike everywhere else, and for a while it hung in balance, and then by the skin of the teeth, the Archbishop won, and the poem was, he wasn't allowed to go on with it. I have to tell you, the Catholic Education Service formally apologised to the author for the homophobia of the Catholic school. So, I saw this and thought, this is really rather terrible, and this is one battle. And clearly, if it was almost lost there, some very brave parents went on Radio 4 and talked about it. The war is going to be very badly lost. So I have a messianic complex, I'm afraid. And so I organised, from some of the teachers and some of the parents, a committee called DICE. It's Defence of the Integrity of Catholic Education. And what we're doing, we're completely unfunded, we're looking for funds and support. It's all coming out of our own back pockets at the moment. We decided that, so it's Stonyhurst in 2 or 3 weeks' time, we've got a conference, the first conference, we plan to run 4 a year if we can, where we're going to tell governors and parents and teachers who want to remain faithful to Catholicism what their legal rights are, and to remind them what their ethical and moral rights are, and begin to try and unpack some of the issues to do with accusations of homophobia and with the progressive sexualization. Because one of the problems is that people who do want to be faithful are isolated, and they think they're the only ones. This is the only thing I can think of doing. So I have my friends on Catholic Unscripted, if ever you see that YouTube program, they're two of the people who do it with me. And we've just been out to Chicago because we were invited to go there to look at what the Americans do, particularly with homeschooling. I suspect we're going to lose. First of all, when I wrote to all the diocesan directors of education, saying we wonder what you're doing in the light of this crisis, will you tell us what you're doing to help governors and teachers and head teachers fulfill their Catholic obligations? And every single door was slammed in our face. And I've already told you that what the Catholic Education Service are doing. So there's no way through there at all, so we're just doing it by ourselves. Luckily, we have a friend who has most of the emails, and we can invite people to come. So if they come, and we continue to manage to fund and to put on these 4 conferences a year, then at least we'll have a kind of rolling program for people who want to be Catholic and want to support it. So that's the best we can do. Going out to America, we discovered, because let's say we lose or we don't win, the next thing is homeschooling. Well, the problem is that there are voices on the left that are limbering up to saying that homeschooling should be outlawed in Great Britain. And I don't see any reason why they won't outlaw it. They can do what they did with abortion buffer zones. What is to stop a Labour government coming in and taking those views? Because in the competition between the state and the family, which is one of the ways you can define what the culture wars we're in, the state, as always, the left state, wants to take away children from the family and replace parents with the state. You saw what happened in what was proposed in Scotland just last year, where first of all they introduced hate crime legislation allowing children to report their parents' homophobic or racist comments to the police in the kitchen, around the kitchen table, and they wanted to provide a state guardian for every child. So that every child had a kind of state social worker guardian they could relate back to the state through. These are 2 pieces of legislation that were part of the Scottish legislative programme. They both haven't passed, but they nearly did. And if they haven't passed this time, they might next time, depending on what the SNP get up to. But it's very, it's very close. So homeschooling may absolutely be the only way you can look after your children as a Catholic. Interestingly, the Americans have done some formidable things there because they have a separation of church and state, or of conscience and state, and so there's a whole homeschooling industry there, and there are overarching Catholic organisations that have put curricula together and produce teachers. They're fantastic. We went in to visit one. I was in Chicago just last week, just come back from there. In the middle of our conversation, the headmaster said, "We're sorry, we've got to stop. The whole school says the rosary this time, and the Angelus." Everyone went down, and in front of the crucifix, the whole school prayed it. Now, the price that the teachers are paying is they have no health insurance. They're paid half what somebody else. They have no access to health, and they've all got big families. But that's the price they are paying to work in the private sector. It still costs somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 a year to pay for the fees, but that's not as much as you have to pay in a year. But nonetheless, what they've done is they've done some very good work indeed. So there's a thing called the Chesterton Academy, and I'm trying to make some links between people who want to do homeschooling in England and the Americans, so that they can begin to share resources as the prospect of giving your children to even Catholic state educators becomes unacceptable for parents. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we do know that we have a problem, and we do know that we don't, as Catholics, want to give the education of our children to people who are going to teach them corrosive, perverting, and non-Catholic values. All I can say is we're in a fight, and we just have to fight the fight as best we can. We don't know what the outcome will be, but we're not going down without fighting. Is that all right? Maybe there are educationists here who know more than I do.
it's a theology question, actually, in relation to your talk tonight. I understand the concept of faith and the personal relationship with God, each and every one of us can have in this room. Let's say if you're speaking to a non-believer or agnostic, and you're going from the bare minimum regards to the metaphysical reason for the presence of a deity, how would you approach that and say, over coffee, you're trying to convince your brother or sister or someone else that metaphysically the presence of God or the possibility of God exists?
Yes. Well, the trouble is I may be too simplistic to be of much help to you, because every time I try and persuade myself to be an atheist, and I put myself, if I'm having an argument, I try and look at the other side of the coin. So I've often tried to put myself in atheist's shoes. I think it's such unimaginable stupidity. I don't know how they do it. Well, because I spend my whole life just trying to manage as a human being. I don't find it particularly easy to manage as a human being, to stay sane, to stay balanced, but above all, to love my enemy, and to deal with forgiveness, issues of forgiveness and hope and charity, all of which are sort of the theological virtues and spiritual graces, which are absolutely essential to functioning half healthily as a human being. And it's jolly difficult being a Christian. But it's infinitely worse being an atheist, because you have to imagine when you get up in the morning that there is no reason and no purpose and no narrative to explain what you're doing. The best you can do is to say, I'm an unfortunate accident of biology, trapped inside a body that's crying out for meaning. And I will resist meaning as long as I possibly can, in order to fulfill my biological functions, which really involve going to the toilet, eating and making love when you can. I mean, it's a bit of a bleak existence. Because the truth is, they're not telling the truth when they say they're atheists. They absolutely live like there's meaning. Of course they do. They have ambitions and they have hopes, they have value systems. They have a universe filled with it. It's their meaning, it's their preferred meaning, which they've invented to get by. They don't even admit it to themselves. They just say there is no morality, there is no meaning. And they get very cross with you when you say, oh, you Christians think you've got more moral than us. Well, we have morals too. Atheists tell me they have morals. Where the hell do they get them from? I'm sorry, pardon me. But really, where do they get their morals from? Well, the answer is, I suppose, a form of social contract. It's better than the whole human rights argument. There are no human rights unless you say either God gives them or they're part of a social contract. Well, what is this social contract whereby we engage in rights? I was never asked to take part in one. They're derived from Judeo-Christian morality and then applied in a kind of haphazard, semi-convenient way, and they're believed in when they want to. And it's the most dreadful way of doing ethics. It's really slipshod, and it doesn't work very well. I've never met an atheist yet who really doesn't. I mean, the people who are best suited were the French existentialists, and many of them wanted to kill themselves because it's a dreadful place to be. So the fact is, every one of us, as human beings, we're desperate for meaning. Psychologists and sociologists will tell us we can't live without it, and if no one will give us meaning, we'll construct our own meaning. Fine. Well, then we're in a position where we're competing for better meanings as human beings. Well, most of the atheists I know live in fairly grey universes, full of inconsistencies, where there are some moral rules they believe in and others they don't. They're not very well thought out. And frankly, it's an ethics of convenience. They do what they want. And for as long as there's no God and no accountability, they get to live this contradictory ethics of convenience, smorgasbord, I'll do what I want. But it doesn't impress me. And it wouldn't, their job is to persuade me to be an atheist. There's no meaning. But everything I've ever believed in has meaning. I mean, Lewis talks about Sehnsucht, this German phrase which is to do with human longing. And he says, when you read a poem or you hear some music or you fall in love, do you really think it was an accident that you have? Because they don't have much biological purchase, these things. There's nothing in poetry that actually makes you a more successful biological organism. There's nothing in architecture that makes, cathedrals are very inspiring, but what's wrong with warehouses? They do things better. So why do people want to live with cathedrals? Why do they want to live in the shadow? What's going on? And the answer is there's some kind of extra dimension that we can't prove, but we're very aware of. And when we deprive ourselves of it, we really don't flourish. Would you rather live in a European cathedral city or in downtown Chicago full of box units? Everyone wants to live within the beauty of Christian architecture. Everybody does. And this is because we claim that it flows from the grasp of this profound meanings of a complete seamless package with our metaphysical and moral and philosophical beliefs. And we can prove that. It is a complete seamless package. But their lives are incoherent and contradictory. Why should we, who have the best architecture, the best music, the best meaning, the best intellectual journeys, and can present a coherent package, give way to these selfish people who live really incompetent ethical lives of inner inconsistency? Why should we? We have the strong will. I don't need to persuade people to become Christians. I don't have to ask them what on earth they're getting out of life not being Christians. I mean, I can be eaten up with unforgiveness. People have done me some quite nasty things in my life. And yet, in order to be able to be free from that, I absolutely depend on Christ. And I ask other atheists, how do you deal with your revenge and your resentment? And they don't. They get eaten up by it. So many of the broken families and broken relationships and political fallout to do with people seeking revenge and vengeance. Vengeance is a very dangerous thing in politics and in society. Christians deal with it in a very beautiful way that allows other human beings to flourish. Just, I say to atheists, well, tell me how you do with forgiveness then. Because I don't think you do with it very well. And I know absolutely that whether you're talking about the Serbo-Croatian War or nationalist conflicts or kind of projecting we do on other people, there's nothing remotely as effective as Christianity for dealing with the kind of toxin of self-interest and hatred. So I've knocked around with a lot of atheists. But the other thing is, they're not really atheists, they don't think. It's a posture. It's just a posture holding God off for the sake of convenience. I think the only person who came near to it was Christopher Hitchens, whose clarity of thought I thought was rhetorical powers were astonishing. But at the end, it's anecdotal. At the end, it looks very much as though Christopher Hitchens wanted to throw himself into the arms of a forgiving God, if I've been told the truth. So I don't. There we go. Does that help? I'll go on ranting. I'm sorry. When I get tired, I stop thinking clearly. Yes, please. I'm so sorry. You're in charge, Bishop.
You mentioned Catholic Eucharistic miracles.
Yes.
And I read something many years ago. The Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth,
yes.
She was in the Scottish Highlands,
yes.
having her portrait done, photograph. Took about half an hour or longer. The midgets didn't come out, because it's in Scotland, midgets didn't come out, right? Not little midgets, midgets that bite you. And the minute she cracked up and went off, the crew was attacked by all the midgets, or mages, right? So does that qualify as a Protestant miracle?
I'll have to ask the Pope.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And we have gone over time, 12 minutes, and we should be people of our word. And people have things to do and places to go, and people come all the way from Dublin and so many places. And great to see you all here. I'm sure we'll all take away things from this talk. One thing that struck me while Gavin was speaking was when he said that God must trust us a great deal to give us this time in which to be born, and to entrust us with the treasure of the faith in the church. So if we can look at things that way, we know the challenges, and let's pray that we do our part in standing up for Jesus, in praying to him. I love what Gavin said about what prayer. It depends on the Spirit, Holy Spirit. Let's pray for all the children who are being confirmed in these days as well around the diocese. And on all your behalf, I would really like to thank Gavin. I've had him in my company now since Saturday afternoon, and fascinating character. And I'm delighted that we all got the opportunity tonight. He's going to be in Maynooth tomorrow, in St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, for a conference on evangelization and vocation, and if you would please pray for that, because we are starting a year of vocation to the priesthood, diocesan priesthood, for 1 year, praying particularly for diocesan priests. So that's tomorrow. Just to let you know, a little housekeeping thing, there is a Fox's biscuit tin there, which is empty, and if you would like to contribute to the coffee, to the room, we would be most grateful for your generosity, and thank you so much. Let's take something away with us from tonight. I'm sure the Holy Spirit will inspire each one of us. And seeing as we are in the time of Easter, could we sing a Regina Coeli to Our Lady? Regina Coeli, Alleluia. We are Renuisi Portale, Alleluia. Resurrexit, sicut dixit, Alleluia. Ora pro nobis Deum, Alleluia. There's a choir in the making here. I would love to get your suggestions about Catholic theology going forward, and maybe there's somebody here who would like to help us in that. And if you haven't already given your name on the list, please do. And I take it that if you have written your email, that you give your consent to get emails for Catholic theology in the future. Philip, we really should have given you the microphone each time, so apologies for that. Safe home to you all. Could we thank our speaker for this riveting talk? He has crossed the Tiber, and now some of you will be crossing the shore. So safe home, and God bless.